Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This morning, as we enter into the book of Leviticus, and as we hear a little bit about Korban, we'll get to it in a moment. I want to actually take us a little bit further back in our Torah reading than what we read. We skipped a little bit ahead to actually the very first word. We open the book of Vayikra on this Shabbat, and the very first thing that happens is this, right? It says, Vayikra el Moshe. God calls to Moses. You'll notice it's not a very dramatic moment. If you didn't look closely at the Hebrew, you may miss how profound this statement actually might be in context.
Are you talking about the small...
Don't spoil it for me, Rob. Shh. There's no burning bush. There's no parting of the sea. There's no thunder at Sinai. It's a quiet moment. 3 words. And yet the rabbis and mystics across generations have not been able to leave them alone. Because if you look closely at the Torah scroll, as Rob did, and as Rob knows, if you lean in close enough to notice, the first word of this entire book, the Aleph, at the end of the word Vayikra, it's written smaller. Smaller than every other letter in Torah. Almost as if it is trying to not be seen. And so I want to sit with this smallness for just a moment. But first, some context. Vayikra, which we know in English, it's the book of Leviticus. It's perhaps the book of the Torah that most of us maybe don't feel as close or as intimate to. Genesis gives us origin stories and family drama. Exodus gives us liberation and revelation. But what does Leviticus give us? Some burnt offerings, some skin conditions, some priestly garments. One can argue that it reads like a manual, written for a world that no longer exists and a language that no longer speaks to us. And yet, the ancient rabbis make a remarkable pedagogical choice. They teach that when a children begins to learn Torah, they didn't actually start at the beginning. Not with the words in the beginning God created and with the creation story. Rather, they started here with Vayikra, with this book. And the obvious question that all of you should be asking is, why? The answer, I believe, lives in the small Aleph. The commentators teach that Moshe, when it came time to write the word Vayikra in this book, he wanted to write something different. That he actually wanted to write the word Vayikar without the Aleph. Now, Vayikar means something like he happened to encounter or it occurred by chance. It is actually the word the Torah uses when God appears to Bilam, back in the book of Genesis, a prophet outside of Israel. It implies that this is an accidental meeting, a coincidence, something that just happened to happen. Moses, out of his extraordinary humility, wanted to write himself that way. He did not feel worthy of being called. He wanted to diminish his own encounter with that which is divine to make it seem like a chance occurrence rather than something deliberate. But God said no. Moses, write the Aleph. You were called. I called you by name. This was no accident. And so Moses wrote the Aleph. But he wrote it small. We can consider this a compromise. A negotiation between his own sense of unworthiness and the divine insistence that was calling. And I find this negotiation profoundly amazing. How many of us move through our lives feeling like an encounter we long for with something larger than ourselves is just a coincidence, a moment that happened to happen? How many of us resist the idea that we are actually being called? Not by accident, but on purpose. Not incidentally, but intimately. And then there's Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, who adds another layer to this teaching. He points out that the difference between Vayikra and Vayikar, between being called and being encountered by chance, is in Hebrew almost invisible. One nearly inaudible Aleph differentiates between the two. And so he writes that this is the Torah's deepest message. Do not expect the presence of the divine to always be as dramatic as the parting of the sea. Sometimes the call is quiet. Sometimes it comes in a small, soft voice. Sometimes it is so subtle that you could mistake it for a coincidence. This, I want to suggest, is what all of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, is about. It's not the animal sacrifices per se, not the technical details of priestly procedure. Vayikra, rather, is a book about calling out and being called. It is a book about how human beings reach toward the divine and how the divine reaches back. It is a book about connection. Our Shinshiniyot taught us this morning the Hebrew word for korban, for a sacrifice, but it comes from the root that means to draw near. And so every ritual that is laid out in Leviticus, it is an opportunity to be in connection. It's about proximity. It is about closing the distance between the human and the holy. The ancient Israelites brought a korban because they felt something open up inside of them, some crack of longing or gratitude or grief, and they needed to go and do something with it. They needed to make the interior exterior. They needed their inner life to have an outer form. Now, this is where our own tradition, the Reconstructionist tradition, could have something to say here. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the teacher who gave shape to so much of what we think about Jewish life, understood God not as a supernatural sovereign issuing commands from above, but rather as the power within reality that makes for wholeness, for shlemut, for what he called salvation in the deepest sense of the word. And he understood ritual not as obligation imposed from the outside, but as the community's living practice of reaching toward that wholeness together. So one modern teacher reflecting on this very moment in the Torah asks a question that I think Rabbi Kaplan would have loved. When that anonymous voice calls out to Moses at the opening of Vayikra, at first, we are not sure who is calling. Is it the voice of God, or is it the voice of community? It isn't immediately clear. But Rabbi Kaplan, I suggest he would say yes. It's both. They are not as separate as we think. You see, the holy calls to us through each other. And the rituals of Vayikra, they are not relics. They are the architecture of a community that keeps reaching out together toward that which makes life profoundly holy. And I'll argue, we are not all that different from those ancient Israelites. This is what our rituals are for. Shabbat is a form of a korban. Lighting candles, coming together into the sanctuary, opening up a siddur, stumbling through the Hebrew, showing up even when it is hard to do so. All of it is an act of drawing close. It is drawing near. And so this is the invitation that I want to extend to you as we read not just this one portion, but the whole book of Leviticus together. Let us read Vayikra not as a museum piece, as something ancient, but as a letter. A letter that begins, as the best letters do, with a name. Your name. Because the small Aleph, it's not only about Moses. It's about you. And it's about me. It's about all of us. It belongs to every person who has ever wanted to write themselves out of the picture, who has felt that the moments of genuine connection that they experienced were accidents and actually not meant for them. The small Aleph says, no, it was not an accident. You were called. And the question is not whether the call is real. The question is whether this year, at this moment, today, are you willing to hear it? So Vayikra teaches us that the call goes out not to those who are the largest and the loudest, but to those who are willing to make themselves small enough to listen. May this book be, for each of us, not a list of ancient laws, but an open door to connection and to each other. Shabbat Shalom.